Hello everybody and welcome to part 26 of the Star Wars Legends Chronological Review series. Today we're going to begin kind of winding down the Knights of the Old Republic comic story as the story's lingering plot threads begin to kind of weave together and consolidate as we head towards the end of the series. However, some of the series' most interesting stories, character moments, and big reveals are still yet ahead of us as we continue the story of Zayne Carrick and his friends, dive into the mysterious background of Jerael, and even get a glimpse to the ongoing war through the eyes of Revan and Malak. So, without further ado, let's dive straight into it. Starting with issue 42, which contains a one-issue arc titled Masks, we see Jerael on her own traversing the jungles of War Tandel to distract herself from her troubles, namely that she has recently revealed to Zayne and her other allies to have once been a slaver. To her dismay, she's tracked down by Zayne himself, who still wants answers. She explains that the Crucible, a powerful slaving organization, kidnapped her as a child to fight in their slave pits. She eventually rose in the ranks though and became a handler to try and get more kids through to the dueling leagues and out of the pits. She eventually met Camper, and the rest is history, until Zayne came along and, according to himself, ruined everything. Zayne isn't deterred and tries to get through to Jerael that she has friends and they can take down the Crucible together. She isn't having it though, in hopes that he can let her run from her past the way that she helped him run from the Jedi. At the nearby town of Gantralia, Zayne discovers that the Republic Navy has come to visit the planet, running into an old Jedi friend, a KOTOR named Faro, who reveals that the Jedi have officially joined the war against the Mandalorians. Faro explains that his homeworld KOTOR had been deserted as of 12 years ago, and that those KOTOR that survived gave fragmented tales of attacks from Mandalorians who've hated the KOTOR since the Sith Wars. Malak's Jedi Master saw the KOTOR's testimony as valuable to the war effort and went to visit the planet, finding no KOTOR but discovering a mask on the beach. When the Master picked up the mask, every Jedi present witnessed the specters of a past battle between the Mandalorians and the KOTOR. One Mandalorian soldier told her allies to stand down as the KOTOR were defeated, but Cassus Fett ordered their deaths nonetheless. The Jedi Master claimed the mask, swearing that it would not be removed until the Mandalorians have been defeated once and for all, dubbing themselves Revan. Outside the city, Malak tells the same story to Jerael, Griff, Slisk, and LB, explaining how Revan's testimony helped persuade the High Council to finally, formally join the war. He also tells how his own homeworld of Quelli was destroyed by the Mandalorians, and that though nobody remembers who he was before the Jedi, everyone will remember Malak. Malak wants Jerael to join their fight with her natural talent and experience, and even for her to potentially learn to use the Force, but she's pretty hesitant. Roland, however, appears and seems to make her decision for her, determined never to let her out of his sight. Roland and Malak have an argument and come to blows, but Zayne and Faro arrive to break it up. A Republic Navy officer explains to Malak that Rollo isn't a soldier anymore, but a sports hero, and the Jedi War movement really can't afford any more scandals. Malak continues to try and make his point to Zayne this time, but Zayne ends the discussion by kissing Jerael, calling her sweetheart and telling everyone that they have plans on the other side of the galaxy. Zayne's little show of affection is just a ruse, but Jerael thanks him for throwing Malak off their trails for the moment. Zayne explains that he thinks it's valuable to buy Jerael some time so she can work through her personal troubles, and Jerael asks him if he really thinks that they can break the Crucible. Zayne tells her that he has more resources to call upon than she can imagine. Going into issue 43, beginning a new arc titled The Reaping, we see a group of aliens in space engaging in dust diving, a quite dangerous profession that involves excavating unstable asteroids for the valuable thorolide crystals inside. The unscrupulous boss of the mining ship orders more miners into the fray, even though a team was just lost to an exploding geyser. The team protests, but the boss feels he can do as he pleases with the Jedi gone to fight their war. Suddenly, Zayne and Jerael arrive, both sporting Crucible tattoos, claiming that their slaves are no longer available for their old prices, and they're here to collect in advance by claiming some of the mining harvest themselves. Later, they update Griff on their secret plan, assuring him that they're only there to steal the crystals. Zayne doesn't like lying to him, quietly anticipating a more chaotic mission with their true goal of freeing the slaves. Zayne and Jerael make their way down to the lower levels, expecting 8 to 10 slaves, which they should easily be able to rescue, but discover that even after the morning's heavy casualties, there are over 80. As the slaves begin another mining run, the core of our boss discovers that Zayne and Jerael aren't legit Crucible slavers. Zayne desperately switches up the plan, landing on the asteroid with the slaves in an attempt to hail Griff for a much more immediate rescue. As Zayne and Jerael fight off armed supervisors, they call Griff, saying that they have something else of great value that they need to pick up. As Griff moves to collect them, he watches, flabbergasted, as Zane uses the Force to float all of the slaves up to safety. As Zane argues with Griff, Sky Reaper droids, or Screepers for short, ambush them, signaling the arrival of the real Crucible under the command of Captain Dace Galliard to reassert control over their, product. Blasting into issue 44, we get a flashback of Captain Galliard finding a young Jarael, then named Odessa, amidst a patrol of Screepers. He isn't a friendly presence, though. As Jarael remembers the moment Galliard claimed her for the Crucible, she witnesses Galliard bear down on her with the full might of his battleship, found once again. Jarael is too shocked to resist when a Screeper scoops her up. Zane tries to assist but gets overwhelmed, but the two are rescued by Roland, who comes in blazing with his jetpack. They all finally board the ship, but Griff is furious, explaining that if they take off now, they'll ruin the whole crop of crystals that they've harvested. There's nothing more important to Griff than money, unless, however, somebody's shooting at him. The crew can't turn the ship around to shoot back, so they explore a new strategy, shooting a harpoon into the Crucible ship, piercing the hole and dragging it towards them, while also spraying xenoboric acid on the Screepers. Panicking, Galliard signals the hot prospect, reaching Jarael and telling her that he'll let the slaves and the ship go if she goes with him to reunite with the Crucible and everyone there who misses her. Before the proposal can go anywhere further, though, Zane executes another crazy plan. By jamming the giant centrifuge at the center of the ship, the force of its spin transfers to the rest of the vessel, freeing them from the Crucible and allowing them to escape into hyperspace. Recovering at the Coordinate Cluster, a friendly freighter captain takes the slaves to a refugee center, while Griff berates Zane and Jarael for trying to scam such a dangerous enemy behind his back. He wonders aloud if anyone else has a secret past, asking if Roland is secretly a Bith band leader using them to get to his next gig. Shaken by the experience, Jarael is now determined to stop the Crucible before they can destroy more families like her own. Though Griff sympathizes, he knows little enough about the Crucible to know that means they're dangerous, but everyone else votes to fight them, and he laments that democracy is what ruins capitalism. Elsewhere, Galliard is reprimanded and beaten by Shantique, furious at his loss against Jarael. A Sannyasin named Baron Jar doesn't allow her to kill him, though, asking her to redirect their focus on their new enemies, which includes the dangerous renegade Jedi. He implores her to work with him and to find Jarael, who apparently does not yet know the true nature of the Crucible. Far away, on Coruscant, Demogol, the Mandalorian scientist who has been captured and comatose since Flashpoint, suddenly awakens, muttering about a Jedi on Flashpoint he needs to see. His nurse tells the guards to call the Defense Ministry and tell them that Demogol is alive and awake. Moving on to issue 45 with the 2-issue Destroyer arc, we get a flashback to Shantique's childhood at an enigmatic academy hosted by a Zeltron professor. She's rowdier and tougher than the other children, and when Galliard arrives to scout the children for mysterious reasons, he chooses her. In the present, Shantique surveys the slave training pits on the desolate planet Volgax. In the pits, Zane, disguised as a captured Republic Navy officer, does his best to avoid violence, but is eventually put up against a Kamasi named Snout, who forces Zane to use the Force in self-defense. Shantique orders him up, and he identifies himself as Karth Camlin, arguing that he must be released as people will be looking for him. Volgax is a well-hidden world, however, and Shantique dismisses him after recognizing his promise as a fighter. Baron Jar tells Karth that he must fight the Kamasi and explains that the species can share memni, memories of past traumatic experiences. He remembers every fight involving every Kamasi that's ever been to Volgax, which makes him quite the formidable opponent. Later, during Chow time, Snout identifies Zane as a Jedi, and he confirms he's a scout and that he has friends who are bringing help. Snout's true memories are foggy, but he remembers that he was once a history student named Ralthar Satan, and he shares his painful memni with Zane, gathered from the experiences of many other Kamasi, drawing from hundreds of years of pain. Zane collapses in agony, which confirms to Baron Jar and Shantique that Zane is a Jedi. Zane later awakens in Shantique's chambers, reeling at the meaninglessness of all the deaths of those in the Crucible, but Shantique believes that the Jedi are just as violent. She asserts that the Jarael he knows is a lie, that sweet little Odessa is long gone, and that Jarael, the Crucible name that's written on her face, means destroyer. Coming into the 46th issue, Jarael argues with the crew about how their plan could have possibly gone so wrong as they can no longer track Zane. At a loss for allies who are free to help them, Jarael implores LB to tell her who Zane's mysterious new allies are. The droid reveals that during their private conversations, Zane wasn't actually talking to LB, but through him, and activates his holotransmitter to call Shell. Back on Volgax, Shantique reveals that Jarael is a bit older than Zane thought, at 25 years old, old, and that she and Jarael are both from the same mysterious academy. She shows him that she stabbed her in the back once, literally, confirming to Zane that Shantique was the supervisor Jarael had to challenge to climb the ranks. After that, Shantique had been shipped away with other slaves that were deemed failures, but found the power within herself to survive and take her revenge against her new masters. Eventually, she found her way back to the Crucible, which doesn't really make sense to Zane, but Shantique was happy to serve as Magister Impressor, overseeing new recruits and never having such power held over her own head ever again. Shantique pushes very hard to erode Zane's trust in Jarael, but he sees right through her, suspecting that she could be using the Force to skew his emotions. Frustrated, Shantique sends Zane back to the pits to fight with the Kamasi. Disheartened, Zane still refuses to fight Rolthar, who claims that his mind has been cleared since it was touched by Zane. He seems to remember the very origins of the Crucible, that it's a machine once created by the Sith Lord Ieldis to churn out powerful armies, but never stopped long after Ieldis turned to dust. Now, the Crucible's only goal is to go on. Despite Zane's protests, Rolthar fights him, but after a struggle where he pins down Zane with a knife, Rolthar stabs himself in the chest instead, and as he dies, he implores Zane to try to forget. As Zane cries over Rolthar's body, Shantique reasserts the cruel meaninglessness of all the fighting and claims that she's now done with him. As Galliard rounds up all the slaves aboard his ship, he leaves Zane behind, and Ballanjar wonders why. Shantique muses that now, the best way to destroy Zane's crew is to simply leave him with Jarael with the knowledge of everything that she's done. Jarael finds Zane abandoned on the planet's surface and is very happy to see him, sharing how Shell was able to help locate the Crucible, but Zane confronts Jarael with everything Shantique told him, demanding to know why she didn't try even harder to get all of the slaves free. Jarael snaps back that she thought that they were trying to fix those things together, and that Zane has moral standards that are simply impossible to meet. Then she admits that she hadn't gotten rid of the marks on her face because in actuality, in the language of the Crucible, they mean protector. Okay, so first off for my review, I want to say that I really like the way that this series is lightly sprinkling in lore and foreshadowing for the Knights of the Old Republic game without it really overshadowing the story of Zane and the other main characters. It does make it feel a little bit obvious and a little bit shoehorned in every time something connecting to, say, Revan shows up. It's like the series was made to be solely about Zane, but with the Knights of the Old Republic title, so they have to have just a little bit of Revan stuff every once in a while to remind you that this is a Knights of the Old Republic tie-in comic. There's probably no way to perfectly incorporate Revan into the series if you are going to mostly focus on other characters, but overall, I'm very happy that we're getting these updates on the overall war when Zane isn't directly included, and I really don't think it clashes with Zane's story too much. There's probably no perfect way to incorporate Revan into this story that way without clashing with Zane's story a little bit, but I'm happy that we're getting updates on the war, and I'm happy that we're not getting updates on the war like every single issue if Zane isn't directly involved. I really like being able to take a more grounded or wider view of this galaxy without this kind of Luke Skywalker level of importance in a main character. You know, we can focus on things more like lesser trade organizations instead of beat by beat every single really important battle in this war, like we usually follow in the Star Wars movies. All that being said, all that we do end up getting of Revan and the escalation of the war is really interesting, and it definitely deserves a bit of attention. The idea of Revan being a very passionate Jedi and very passionate about saving others and bringing the Mandalorians to justice is a really strong start for a character that we know is doomed to fall to the dark side. It's very similar to how Anakin in the prequels has a good heart but gets carried away with killing people during the Clone Wars and eventually, you know, being attached to certain people that are close to him. Two core parts of Star Wars are finding ways to make stories about these characters compelling, even though, or even because we already know their fates, and of course telling stories about characters who very much intend to do good things end up falling down a darker path because, for lack of better words, they don't care about it in a selfless enough way. The flashback scene on KOTOR overall is really good, and it feels like a really cool cutscene that you would come across in a video game. I do wonder if things like this might be in the KOTOR game, if we end up getting kind of flashbacks to some important events back in the war, maybe when you touch certain items or go to certain locations. That feels like a very cool Star Wars-y thing. Now that I think about it, that's definitely been done already in like Fallen Order and Jedi Survivor that I've already played, so we'll just wait and see. I know if this ends up being true, I'm gonna look like the most total noob for not knowing some super important part of the KOTOR lore. One more note note on Revan is that I find it very fun just how much John Jackson Miller and the artists are able to dance around the fact that Revan kind of is of like an indeterminate appearance and gender, you know, because the character's appearance is chosen by the player in the game. It seems like I've seen that there is a very canonical appearance for Revan that ended up manifesting later down the line in the EU that looks like Keanu Reeves, apparently. I do really like this approach of hiding Revan's appearance, you know, their face, gender, and skin color. It feels like potentially this approach to the character would be distracting, like drawing attention to the fact that this is like a created character, but it really didn't feel that way to me. In fact, I almost think it makes the character more approachable and sympathetic and almost more mysterious and more cool. It's like it's easier for you to project what Revan might be feeling, and it almost, since we don't get to see their face, get to have almost imagine more of an emotional impact. Kind of like that horror movie principle that the creature or whatever is a lot scarier when you don't see it, because you are imagining what is scariest to you. Also kind of reminds me of something that I read about the making of the original Star Wars movie, where George Lucas had Mark Hamill during the scene when he sees his aunt and uncle dead to have a more subdued reaction, so as to make it easier for the audience to put their own feelings on what he might be feeling in that moment. Though Revan isn't the protagonist of this comic series, it is an interesting feeling knowing I'm going to be stepping into the shoes of this character pretty soon, especially seeing Revan's current noble cause unfold, and we know it's going to take a dark turn at some point soon. So moving on from Revan, I'm very happy to see that Jerael, her past, her motivations, and her wants or needs, finally it feels like they're taking center stage, and it feels like that's been long overdue, especially since it feels like Zane has already gone through most of his most interesting character development points. Even though we haven't known much concrete details on her until this point, it's hard to explain, but I just feel like she's been very well characterized up until this point with the way that she approaches herself and interacts with all the different characters. She's very snarky and capable, but it's also very easy to catch her in more vulnerable moments. And really, she's been pretty interesting from the start, just by kind of the subtle suggestion that she's hiding things from Zane and the crew, and really even to herself. However, from a character narrative perspective, it feels like she's usually throughout the series been very dependent on Zane to kind of direct her course. You know, Zane of course is the main character, but it just feels like even when she's starting to go on this more personal journey, she kind of has to rely on Zane as the catalyst to get her from point A to point B, to kind of rescue her at certain points in battles. You know, it's Zane who helps get her out of certain situations and finds the resources that they need to start helping her along this journey to fight this old enemy of hers. It just feels like now that we're getting so late into the series, I don't know if we're going to get to see Jerael really exercise some agency that I think would make her character a lot more interesting and dynamic. I want to see her have even more freedom, the freedom that Zane has had for so long, to make more interesting decisions. It feels like Zane, even when he's not at the emotional center of the story, is still making a lot of the important decisions. It's just frustrating that he is still having to kind of hog center stage or share it when other characters are emotionally, narratively at their most interesting. I don't think this is sexist, say, towards Jerael necessarily. I just think she's really cool, and she might be doing even cooler things if the writing would just give her some more breathing room and give her some more time to really figure some of these things out on her own and solve things with her own wits and maybe her own grasp on resources. We do get a bit of that, but it's mostly off screen and it doesn't really push the narrative forward overall. We kind of left off last volume with her still with Zane, and then we begin this volume with her being found immediately by Zane. And also the fact that Malak is clearly continuing to push some kind of romantic connection, and Roland has his own weird thing going on and just won't let her out of her sight. Those things don't really help either. But now that we are getting more into Jerael's past, I find her backstory very compelling now that we're finally getting to learn more about it. You know, it makes perfect sense that, you know, though Shantique might not see it the same way, Jerael's not really at fault for a lot of the things that she had to do, and rather the things she wasn't fully able to do, and the fact that she as a child was still trying really hard to do those things makes perfect sense with what we know about her character so far. You know, if we had found out that Jerael really did used to be this cruel, evil person and then just completely changed her ways, I don't think that would have been nearly as compelling. It's like as soon as we found out that she was a slaver, I knew that that wasn't the full story, and I think Zane did too, and I'm happy that this story, you know, other than the words from the untrustworthy bad guy's mouth, you know, they're never really trying to make you, the reader, think that Jarael is really a bad person for any of the things that she may have been forced to do. I think there's a continued conversation to be here about the overall presence of evil and institutions and kind of the tough decisions it makes potentially good people have to do against one another. And you know, you shouldn't be fighting each other and squabbling over what little you have. You should be looking towards the people who are holding up this corrupt institution. You know, you should be fighting the people who are holding up this corrupt institution instead of bickering over the meager things that you have as a part of it. We're also so used to Zane being the moral center of this story, and to have Jarael really tell him off for having too high emotional standards for what it means to be a hero was an interaction I was not expecting, but was really satisfying to see, considering how Zane and his ambitions and his, you know, the people who are after him and the conflicts he's undertaking, that's been controlling the story most of the time. This is the kind of moral challenge I said last time I was hoping Zane would eventually be confronted with. And speaking of conflict between all of our protagonists, another development that's interesting to finally watch unfold is Griff starting to get fed up with Zane's moral ambitions as now incorporated into part of their schemes. Though this story is too focused on Jarael and the slavers for this conflict to really have too much prevalence, it's clear that it's possible for there to be some kind of breaking point between Zane and Griff that we haven't seen yet. Their conflicting motivations are still continuing to test Griff's moral fiber and what he's able to put up with. Even if it looks like we don't get more of a brief argument in this volume, and I'm not anticipating it for it to get much bigger later, it does seem that as long as Griff's hide doesn't get vaped in a space battle, he's willing to choke down a temporary loss of profits. It's like I'm anticipating we won't see him really be put in such a tough spot to have to make a really tough moral decision. I feel like we haven't gotten enough build up for him to make some kind of big hero moment or like an even darker turn. I feel like if he was gonna give up Zane like that, it would have been a few volumes ago. At this point, I think Griff is just kind of who he is, and given all the interesting character work we've already gotten out of this series with Zane, Jarael, Lucian, Hazen, and even Roland, I think that we can accept that. So going back to Jarael and the Crucible, I think it reflects very well on Jarael that she was so ashamed to talk about her involvement in all of that. And you know, even though she was aware that she did everything that she could for herself and her fellow slaves, though it, you know, it did make for a bit of a disappointing reveal, since the cliffhanger at the end of the last volume made it seem like the role in her past actions maybe was a little bit more substantially sinister. It just feels like the exposition dump we get from Jarael at the very beginning to be kind of anticlimactic based on how the last volume ended. So speaking of Jarael and her fellow victims, I think that Shantique was a very solid, if not a bit of like a shallow, familiar kind of villain for this part of the series. She's serving as kind of a parallel or foil to Jarael that I think works pretty well. She's being set up almost like Hazen was set up for Zane. Like, this is how Jarael might have ended up if she were, you know, if she felt inclined to make different moral choices, or if she was given a more evil character design. Given what little we do know about Shantique, it does seem that she wasn't really given a good hand in life or really a chance to really make any other decisions at all. Her pretty transparent main motivation of never wanting to feel powerless or unsafe again, it makes perfect sense, even if it doesn't excuse her actions. I think that there is a good discussion here that could be had that's a bit above the philosophical pay grade of me and this channel right now, about Star Wars as a whole and about free will and why people make the choices that they make, especially if you're going to draw parallels and make moral judgments on two characters who grew up in such similar conditions. Obviously, one of the biggest tenets of Star Wars is the idea that succumbing to or escaping from your own personal darkness is a personal decision that you always have the freedom to make, no matter how bad your circumstances are. But it feels like the people who do make bad decisions in a lot of these stories were either seemingly born just straight up evil with like Palpatine with really no any other good tendencies, or they were in situations that basically forced them to, like Shantique, or they crossed some kind of significant threshold of personal trauma that just kind of screwed them over mentally for life. Anakin Skywalker here is, I actually think, an interesting example, a very nuanced and fleshed out example of someone who went through a lot of trauma and was definitely manipulated from early on by evil forces, but was also given a lot of good influences and good people around him. And that makes what I think the prequel trilogy very, very compelling, is because he has these two very strong, visible poles, and it depends entirely on a decision that he makes. You know, obviously, other than the fact that we know the end of the story, it felt like a pretty dramatic toss-up of which side he was going to end up choosing. You know, other characters who aren't afforded as much screen time or focus, like Shantique, even with their motivations and their origins explained to us and made clear, and even if they're understandable and captivating, sometimes it just doesn't really get across that free will message very effectively, in my opinion. You know, that everyone is truly free to make their own choices, especially to the degree that we can outright condemn them when they make mostly bad ones. You know, whether through genetics or upbringing, it's my view that people can't really always choose what coping mechanisms that they have or what actions that they think they even have the option to take. At least that's my specific perspective on free will. Again, above my philosophical pay grade maybe for this channel. You know, this comic with its limited time, especially for this very specific character, single character, it's probably not going to give us much more deep insight into all of that, but Shantique was interesting enough that it made me start thinking about all of that. Why Shantique decides to strut around in the clothes that she does, though, is anyone's guess. So getting into some discussions on lore, I think this is the first time I believe I've seen a Kamasi in a significant role in any Star Wars story. Apparently this isn't even the first time that their feature of Memni, or shared memories, has been showcased. And so while I always appreciate when Star Wars writers make up their own cool new details on some alien species that is like their own pet creation, I find it even more interesting when authors are able to take something someone else made and use it to service their own plot and their own story needs. Kind of like the feature of the sensitivity of the Gotal horns, which was created in a different story. The Kamasi Memni are an excellent and unique way to get across both exposition and emotional weight for Zane, and I think really adds a degree of true horror as well. There aren't really many ways to effectively convey hundreds of years of pain for a character, but when you have the Force and a competent artist on your side, I think it works pretty well. The added bit about how the Crucible was founded by an ancient Sith Lord who has been long since dead, but whose evil kind of has been sustaining the institution anyway, it kind of touches on this through line throughout all of Star Wars, that the Sith are basically directly or indirectly involved with every major conflict or thing that the main characters and the Jedi have to deal with in this series. You know, basically after the Force Wars against the Rakatan Empire that we covered in the first few, like, half dozen parts of this series, it feels like there is scarcely a single thing that doesn't have some indirect or direct influence from the Sith, be that in the form of the Sith more directly themselves, or some other faction, or the Separatists, or the Empire, or the Empire's different splintered factions later on. Even later down the timeline, we end up getting things like the Yuuzhan Vong, which are pretty separated from the Sith. Later on, even after that, we get stuff like Fate of the Jedi and Legacy comics, which I haven't read yet, but I know that there are still continuing, like, finding ways to work in Sith factions that have somehow been hidden away after all this time, after the deaths of Palpatine. I think there probably is some kind of intelligent observation to be made here about how, like, institutions that are founded on evil can continue to have this lingering evil even long after kind of their original purpose has gone away, or even after they go into some kind of reform. But I think the main takeaway I'm taking here is that this series, even when it feels like it doesn't have to, really relies on the Sith to generate its conflicts for the main characters. Like, on one hand, my first instinct when I read that is that it is super cool and menacing that the evil influence of the Sith can linger on in these really unexpected ways, but this series has done such a good job of giving us such unique villains that weren't Sith, or at least weren't directly influenced by the Sith at first that we knew of, and it just feels like I'm starting to get a little irritated that this seems to be something that pops up very frequently in the series. Feels like most of the more interesting villains that we've gotten in this series have a connection to the Sith one way or another, when it feels like maybe, especially for the Crucible, they didn't necessarily have to. You know, maybe the galaxy is just full of some evils that aren't necessarily tied to one specific religious order. And while that does frustrate me a little bit, I think all in all, the idea of a slave organization created by the Sith that has lingered for centuries, basically just self-sustaining itself on this own lingering hate, is a very creepy idea. I suppose that now is as good a time as any to mention that we do get Brian Ching back for this Destroyer arc, as well as the next final volume of the series, and his pencil art is always something that I'm grateful for. There's not much about his art that I haven't already said several times already, but there are quite a few moments on this arc, namely the LEMMiNO sequences I just mentioned, where Ching is really effectively able to convey anguish and despair and rage and horror. He's also able to give Shantique some very sinister smiles as well. I've seen his art so much now, though, that it feels like some of his facial expressions, which I do like, are starting to get pretty similar. And you know, every character that has a humanoid build and a humanoid face has this very specific set of proportions, with like a broad forehead and kind of this pointed chin. But overall, I think Ching's art is always a wonderful thing to see in this series, especially when the stories or the tone tends to skew a little bit darker. Also, side note, quick shout out to the planet Volgax. We only see some brief glimpses of it, but the wide views of like its landscape and the slave pits make it just look so vast and terrifying. There's just something about this planet that really makes it seem like a perfect place for a bad guy slave pit empire to hang out. It's giving me huge Exegol vibes, which is great because Exegol might be my favorite planet in the whole franchise just because of its super cool atmosphere and how it was portrayed in that movie. Bong Dazo returned for the Reaping arc earlier in the volume, and while he's another returning artist that I really don't have much to say about, I do really like the big action sequences that he drew out for the space battle against the Crucible ship. There are some fantastic misty explosions in space and these laser fights that are really enhanced by Michael Atiyeh's signature bright colors for the series that just really pop. Dazo really can hold a candle to Ching, I think, when it comes to angry, creepy, or otherwise pretty effective facial expressions. There are several page-wide spreads from issues 43 and 44 that I won't show the whole thing of here because I'm weary of copyright, but these two issues in particular were just a real joy to look at in ways that this series sometimes doesn't go all the way with, since it's sometimes very dialogue heavy. But seriously, if you haven't already read these comics or aren't reading them along with me, like, what are you even doing here anyway? Seriously, you like, this art is just, the art in the story is, you know, I'm going to reiterate again, is always best consumed when you're reading it for yourself. You know, please, if you can, watch these reviews after you've read the stuff for yourself. We also get a new artist in Ron Chan for issue 41, and his style is definitely serviceable. The action is well drawn, especially for the flashback battle in KOTOR, and his characters all have very crisp lines, these sharp proportions, and expressive features that I all really appreciate. This seems to be his only credit for any Star Wars comic, and I will say that while his art doesn't quite stir or excite me maybe as much as Ching is able to do, I'm very happy with his contribution for this one issue arc. And with that, I think I'm going to close out my review for Knights of the Old Republic Volume 8 Destroyer. For its fantastic action and escalated stakes, but a bit more shallow on the story side, I'm going to give The Reaping 4 Screepers out of 5, and for Destroyer's dark atmosphere and deeply interesting character investigations, I'm going to give that one 4.5 Slaver Death Pits out of 5. I hope you all are looking forward to the 9th and final kind of volume of this series, where we're going to get to see the final fate of Jerael in the Crucible, as well as Zane, Griff, and Rollo, and all the other characters we've come to know and love throughout this series. This genuinely really great fun series that I've had a lot of fun reading and covering. So until next time, may the Force be with you always.